Hi everyone, Nikki Hardy here, and welcome to the final Science Saturday of the season. This time we're talking about garden pests and pathogens. Now, this presentation isn't going to highlight all of the garden pests and pathogens you're more likely to see, simply because there are so many. But this presentation is going to talk mostly about the different resources that are available to help you in your journey to identifying and dealing with pests and pathogens. And it all starts with Integrated Pest Management, or IPM. Now, IPM is an idea that was built around prevention first, and it's all science-based. And it was developed to provide the least risk to people, pollinators, and the environment. And it starts with having healthy plants. And then the first step is to monitor regularly or observe those plants as they grow. Number 2 is to establish and use thresholds for damage and identify the different types of damage, cosmetic damage versus systemic damage. Keep a record of the plants that you are growing, how they're growing, and the different damage or pests that they might deal with, and refer to it for past integrated pest management decisions. Number 4 is to identify any issues with some specificity, and so what type of pest is it that you're dealing with? What is the most likely pathogen that has infected your plant? Then, if you choose to treat that plant, it's to choose the least toxic solution first. And that begins with using cultural controls like sterilizing tools, harvesting early, improving the mulch health, and then biological controls, which focuses on attracting beneficial insects, or even birds. Biorational controls, which include insecticidal soaps, diatomaceous earth, corn gluten, and white vinegar. And so these are different types of chemicals that you can apply to your plants that pose little risk to human health, pet health, and pollinator health. And then finally, as a last resort, chemical controls. And these are chemicals and pesticides that can be used as a last resort, ensuring that you are following label instruction and proper safety procedures. For further reading about integrated pest management, I would direct you to the UMN Extension. There is a link that will be provided in the description of this video for you to learn more details about integrated pest management. So let's get started, and we'll start this with talking about starting with healthy plants. So step 1 is to know your plants. Now this might seem silly, except for I think many of us are probably guilty of being at the garden store going, wow, that's an amazing looking plant, buying it, bringing it home, and maybe not having the proper conditions or care ready for that plant. So it really does start with knowing your plants. And if I could, I would direct you to Growing Healthy Plants. It was part of the February 21st talk of choosing seeds and seed starting. And in this section, I talked about understanding plant needs as well as the different seed starting procedures that will help grow those healthy plants. And so you might want to take a look at that February 21st talk. Or you could consider compost, and I covered this topic as well, February 7th and 14th, on the chemistry of composting as well as composting techniques, respectively. And the big takeaway message from both of those talks was that composting is a microbial-driven process, and the idea is that the microbes in the compost can outcompete pathogenic microbes in the soil. And then another consideration is companion planting. So considering planting plants that have similar water needs next to one another, or fertility needs with the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium needs. Consider planting legumes next to plants that like to be next to legumes. So some of those heavy feeding crops could benefit by having legumes nearby. Or even consider planting what's known as a trap crop. And so this would be a plant that lures pests away from your desired crops to a trap. And so this could be something like a nasturtium, for example. All right, next is to monitor for damage. So number 1 is to know your plant's most likely pests. So with this, you start with your monitoring to look at the leaves. So do your leaves have holes, chewed edges, yellowing, browning, spots, or curling? And so this is an example of a tomato plant that has been infected with what is suspected to be early blight. You'll see that those leaves at the very bottom, this is pretty early in the disease progression. I mean, not super early, it's obviously visible, but this tomato plant is very dense. It could use a pruning, clean up the inside, improve the airflow. But that plant has been infected by the fungus that leads to early blight. You can see that those leaves have yellowing, they're starting to brown in certain spots, they're also curled. And the next step is to look at the stems. So have the stems had signs of boring? Are the stems wilting, or have they been chewed on? Do they have brittle areas? Those are the types of things that are worth noting. So once again, here we have another tomato plant. You can see that this whole plant has been affected now. You'll see that it's different than its neighbors in that the whole plant has turned, the leaves have turned a bit of yellow. It is completely wilted. This is a tomato plant that is dealing with wilt. And then another one that you can't necessarily monitor visually without pulling the plant is the roots. And so the question is if the plant is wilting despite wet soil, check the roots for decay or damage. So if it has been properly watered, if it is still wilting, it is worthwhile to pull up that plant to see if there is some sort of root rot or some sort of pest that has taken hold in that plant. And so just an example of what a normal plant or a healthy plant looks like that hasn't been watered. This is a plant that is just thirsty. And so it is wilted, but its leaves, you can see that they're a little bit bleached, but they're mostly healthy. It just really needs a good drink of water. And going a little bit further onto that, you'll see this is kind of what plants end up doing in various stages of water. So on the far right side, you'll see that that plant is wilted, and it's because it doesn't have enough water. You add some water and it becomes a healthy plant, and no water is wasted. So that's adding just enough water without any type of extra runoff. So if you add a little bit more water, the plant will remain healthy. However, the water is wasted. But if the water cannot remove itself fast enough from the plant will once again wilt because there's too much water, and the water is also wasted. And so watering your plants isn't a matter of, more is more, or more is ideal. It's actually can be the case of more is more. So our plants are looking for just right. And some plants respond very differently to having too much water versus too little water. All right, so the next thing to monitor is the plant growth. And the question here is the plant stunted or malformed? And so here we have a potato plant. You'll see that the plant over on the left is very healthy looking. It's quite robust. It looks to be growing well, very deep green in its leaves. And the plant over on the right, you can see it has actually been infected. The leaves are curling, and it is quite a bit smaller. And so that is something to monitor as well, but is something that you can't really do without having multiples of that plant, right? All right, and then the last one is to actually look for the pests. And so for this, you can observe any webs or beetles, cocoons, eggs, or any type of sticky residue. And so some of these are obviously big. This is a Japanese beetle, very easy to spot, very easy to flick into soapy water and drown, right? Next one is not quite so obvious. This is damage because of spider mites. So each one of those different spots are bite marks. And here you can actually see a spider mite infestation. And when it has reached this point, you'll see that there are actual webs that these spider mites form on that plant. All right, and then the last thing is this really shiny substance that shows up on leaves. This is called honeydew, and this is something that's produced by aphids. And so although I don't have a picture of the aphids themselves, aphids are generally pretty small. This type of honeydew is pretty easy to see. Also, if you park your vehicle outside, let's say you're underneath a tree and you get that really hard to clean stuff on your windshield, that's usually signs that there are aphids up in those trees, and that's the honeydew that is dripping onto your windshield. All right, so next is to establish the thresholds for damage. So once again, got to know your plants. And you start with healthy plants in the right spot, right place, good soil with proper watering to reduce stress and make those plants naturally more resistant. But in the event of damage, you need to first establish whether or not it's cosmetic damage or systemic damage. So, cosmetic damage is damage that affects the looks of the plant, but not necessarily its overall health. This might be bite marks in the leaves or even skeletonized leaves. Often that isn't something that will impact the whole plant, but it will not look very nice. Or maybe you had a plant that suffered hail damage. So this isn't a pest, but it's just Mother Nature. Many of those plants that have suffered hail damage, some of them might be systemically damaged, but some of them might just be dealing with some cosmetic damage. So then your job, if you decide that this is cosmetic, is to monitor for advancing damage and then consider pruning or picking the fruit, just to make sure that, that plant has a good opportunity to continue to thrive. And so when we pick that fruit, we can help encourage new growth with that plant. All right, so systemic then would be damage that would affect the livelihood of the plant. And so with something like this might be a infected plant, or one that is overrun by pests. And so for this, you might consider removing the plant and disposing of the plant if it's in particular pathogens, especially pathogens that can spread. Or consider pruning and disposing the damaged material if it is pests. And so that's just a decision that you get to make, right? And it's important here to note that pest damage can invite pathogenic disease, but pests also attract beneficial insects that can maintain an overall lower pest population for the entirety of the growing season. So it takes some time to get those beneficial insects into your garden, but having pests there for those beneficial insects will make that happen. All right. And what that means is don't feel like you need to stress about getting every single pest off of every single plant. It's okay if you end up missing some. All right, so the next step with IPM is to keep a record. So once again, this starts by knowing your plant. And keeping a record might be something like keeping a garden journal, where you specifically state the location of that plant, including things like whether or not it was in a raised bed, in a ground, if it was full sun, part sun, or mostly shade. Notice any pests that may have visited your plant and had some damage, or any diseases that might have sprung up with that plant. The growth patterns of that plant, that's important because sometimes you end up with, say, tomatillos that grow much larger than anticipated. You want to make sure that if you plant those again in a different spot, they have enough room to grow, right? And so also any type of treatment that you did for that plant in the event of pests or disease, as well as any relevant notes like the taste of the fruit, or the yield, or whether or not it was a drought year or a rainy year. Those are good things to keep note of in case things aren't easily reproducible or expectations aren't met from one year to the next. Another thing with keeping a record is that it makes it easier to do things like crop rotation. And crop rotation is important for many of our vegetable plants because planting one variety of plant, or one type of plant in one location year in and year out invites things like pathogens and pests to settle in and impact each subsequent year of crop. And so you don't want to plant tomatoes in the same spot every year, just like you don't want to plant brassica plants like cabbage or broccoli in the same spot every year, because each year that you do, you invite more pests to come visit those plants, because many of our plants, some pathogens may not overwinter, but many of our pests are actually quite capable of overwintering in the soil. And so you don't want to have things like cabbage worms affect the cabbage one year and then plant cabbages the next year in the same spot and have your whole crop wiped out at the very early stages. Another thing with keeping a record is that it helps you identify susceptible varieties. And so if you are planting 6 different types of tomatoes and 4 of them aren't growing well in one specific location, it could be that those last 2 varieties are not susceptible to whatever the other plants are susceptible to. And so with that, you can actually test in your own garden. You can be a bit of a garden scientist and identify the plants that grow best in those conditions that you have. And then just kind of a little side note here. When I was a postdoc at Northwestern, I took some classes from the Kellogg School of Business and Management. And one of the things that stuck with me was a quote that I remember learning, which is, "Our brains are for thinking, not for remembering." And so if we rely on our brains for remembering, it's not going to do a very good job of thinking. Likewise, if we're using our brains for thinking, it probably isn't going to do a very good job of remembering. And so if we have the ability to keep a record, which many of us do, it would behoove you to keep a record so that you can engage more critical thought towards solving different problems instead of trying to remember what those problems were as you enter a new growing season. All right, next up is to identify with specificity. So once again, it's important to know your plants and know what the most likely pests and diseases are that can affect those plants. All right, so first step then is to identify if the damage is most likely a pest or if it's a disease. And for this, I would recommend starting with "What is wrong with my plant?" search tool with the University of Minnesota Extension. So that's what this ends up looking like, and I'll provide a direct link in the description to this video. All right, so the next thing is also with the University of Minnesota Extension, and this is under the fruit and vegetable gardening page. And that includes a couple of different resources that might prove valuable, including the disease management for vegetable crops and insect management for vegetable crops. Now, I've mentioned vegetable crops, but there's also some really great pages for fruit crops as well. And then another opportunity to identify things that might be impacting your plants is to reach out to a master gardener. So across the state of Minnesota, there are many different master gardener organizations. Crow Wing County has a master gardener organization, which I am very proud to be a part of. And that's the Crow Wing County Master Gardeners. So if you're in Crow Wing County and you're dealing with an issue, I encourage you to reach out and ask a master gardener. And to do this, you can go to our website, Crow Wing County Master Gardeners, and click the Ask a Master Gardener drop-down menu, in which you'll have a couple of options as to how to ask a master gardener your garden-related questions. And then for people who are not in Crow Wing County, it's probably a better idea to reach out to your own local master gardeners, because many master gardeners are familiar with what is specific to their region. So if you're in the far northeast region of Minnesota, it might be a little bit more challenging for someone in the far southwest region of Minnesota to be able to answer questions, because Minnesota is a big state, and it's best just to reach out to the local experts within your area. So reach out to your local Master Gardener Extension, and you can find information about who your local Master Gardener Extension is on the University of Minnesota Extension website. All right, so let's say that you have some sort of pest or pathogen that you choose that it is essential you deal with. All right, so the step is to start with the least toxic way first. So just as a review, that's number 1, cultural controls, number 2, biological controls, 3, biorational controls, and 4, chemical controls. All right, so cultural controls. Let's remember that pathogens are microbes. Microbes are microscopic, which means they're not visible with the unaided eye. Pathogens are really hard for a lot of people because you can't readily see them. And so, when it comes to cultural controls, it is of the utmost importance to clean and sterilize your tools between garden spaces or plants. And that will help spread or help prevent the spread of pathogens. Remember, those pathogens are things that you cannot see, but our plants can get sick just like you and me. And so you want to make sure that you're minimizing the risk of spreading pathogens between plants. And it's also important to note that many pathogens can infect many different types of plants. So there is a type of wilt that primarily affects tomato plants that can also impact other crops such as carrots. And so a pathogen is not necessarily specific to one type of plant. All right. So another suggestion is to harvest early because when you keep the fruit, so now we're talking botanically a fruit, so that includes things like vegetables or fruit. It's just, like a cucumber would be the fruit of a cucumber plant or an apple of an apple tree. Keeping the fruit on the plant risks pest, which then can invite disease. And then another suggestion is to improve mulch, and that helps prevent fungal infection from ricocheting droplets, especially during heavy rains. And so when the heavy rain drops onto the soil, it can bounce back up onto the leaves of your plants. And if it brings with it fungal spores, those spores can infect that plant that way. And so helping improve mulch can also help retain water. And so that plant doesn't have to be watered quite as frequently, but it can also help maintain more levels of water, I guess. And then also it can help keep the roots of that plant cool during the hot summer and warm during like the evenings or in the spring and the fall. All right, so another suggestion is to purchase disease-free seed and transplants from a reliable supplier. Now, when it comes to pests in particular, this is an important one because we have things in Minnesota now that are called jumping worms, and they can be quite devastating when they end up in a ecosystem. And so make sure that when you are purchasing your seeds and transplants, you're doing so from somebody who has experience doing those types of things and that you can trust won't end up giving you more than what you bargained for. All right. So another cultural control would be something like crop rotation, and this would be rotating crops away from a contaminated area for 3 to 5 years, noting that that area must continue to be weeded. And so with crop rotation, we talked about it a bit with brassicas and tomatoes, but many annual plants like that would benefit from crop rotation. And then another one that isn't necessarily intuitive is to avoid excessive fertilizers, especially those that are containing high levels of nitrogen, because a lot of pathogens actually have nitrogen demands as well and flourish in those high nitrogen environments. And so if you can rein back your use of nitrogens, you can help rein back the risk of pathogens for those plants. And then, of course, if you know in advance that you're probably going to be dealing with something, let's say it might be wilt, because let's say, out of experience, you dealt with wilt last year, then you could consider disease-specific control or cultural controls. And this is some information that you can find from the University of Minnesota Extension, or even if you're viewing this from out of state, your own local extension unit. All right, so moving on to the next step. All right, so our cultural controls may not have done the job completely. So the next thing then is to invite your pest predators into your garden ecosystem. And in order to do that effectively, we need to identify some of our most effective beneficial insects. And so for this, we'll start off with the lacewings. And lacewings are especially good at controlling aphids. And so here's two pictures of two varieties of lacewings that we have in Minnesota. Over on the left, you'll see we have the brown lacewing. Over on the right, we have the green lacewing. And then that bottom picture actually shows the eggs to these lacewings. And so they're very unique. It looks like it's a little egg that's strung up by a string, right? So if you end up encountering something like that, it's best to let it be because you're inviting these beneficial insects into your area to control something like aphids. And aphids are truly disastrous with the damage that they can do as well as the diseases that they can spread. All right, next up then is lady beetles or ladybugs. And so here we have over on the left side a lady beetle that is mature. And then over on the right side, on the top, we have those yellow eggs. And on the bottom, we have a lady beetle larva. And it's important to also mention here that even though the Asian lady beetle is a bit of a nuisance, especially in the fall when they come into your home uninvited, that they too are voracious eaters of aphids. And so they do a really good job at the job that they're meant to do. But they are not native lady beetles. And so the decision is up to you as to how you effectively manage ladybugs. But ladybugs are very good at doing the job that they are meant to do, which is to control aphids. All right, so next up is the pirate bug. And the pirate bug is really effective against thrips. And so here we have a pirate bug. We have a mature over on the left. We have an immature over on the right. Immature, you can see, is actually on somebody's fingertip. Those are the rings that make up our fingerprint. And so, yeah, these are pirate bugs, also very effective in the garden. And then, this is one of my favorites I identified in our own garden last year, the hoverfly. And the hoverfly is really great against aphids, as mentioned, scale thrips, and caterpillars. And so here we have a hoverfly. It looks very similar to a bee, but with a different wing orientation in particular. And if you notice its eyes, the eyes also look very different from a bee. And so it looks like a fly pretending to be a bee. And then over on the right side, you can see the larval stage of the hoverfly, and it is taking care of an aphid right there. So that green mass is an aphid. So pretty cool bugs to have around, and they do a great job of controlling many different garden pests. And then, of course, we have spiders, and spiders are really effective at controlling many different types of insects in particular. And so here's two of my favorites. Last year, one of my favorite spiders to encounter in the garden is the crab spider. That's shown over there on the left. They're really interesting. They are hunting spiders, so they don't make a web, and they'll just kind of hang out on the plants and wait for insects to come to them. Really cool spider, kind of creepy to look at. And then over there on the right, we have just the standard barn spider, really big, right? Also, they don't spin a web, but they are very effective at controlling insect populations. All right, and then the last one is beneficial nematodes. And it's important here to note that you're not going to be able to see these nematodes. These are microscopic. They live in the soil, but they do a really great job of controlling a lot of the soil pests, including caterpillars and different microbes, also aphids, a lot of the things that can land in the soil. And there are also pathogenic nematodes, but having beneficial nematodes in the soil is also a good thing. So that's just another call for, like, be careful about your insecticide and pesticide use, because it could also impact your beneficial bugs that are in your garden. And there is a microscopic view of a nematode. So basically, it looks like a little worm. All right, so the next step up is biorational controls. So biorational controls are the next step up because they're generally less harmful to human and animal health as well as our pollinators. And so these could be in the form of microbial controls. And so different forms of streptomyces have been shown to help keep in control different pathogenic pathogens. And then also, like I had mentioned earlier, I have a compost presentation about bokashi fermentation and the role of microbes there. And EM1 microbes are thought to outcompete pathogenic microbes for resources. So introducing beneficial bacteria into your soil can actually help get rid of pathogenic microbes because they compete for the same resources. And in particular, bacillus, which is part of the EM1 microbes with bokashi fermentation, bacillus can produce antifungal peptides and play a special role in preventing root rot for some plants. And then additionally, having microbes added to your soil can also help increase nutrient availability for plants, which would then also help those plants be nice, big, and strong, right? And so then the next step is botanical or mineral control. And one of the big ones here is corn gluten. And this is a pre-emergent herbicide. And it's important to note that corn meal is not the same as corn gluten meal. And what this might look like is here, this is not, any type of advertisement for preen. This is not me saying you should use preen, but this is just an example of how you might find corn gluten meal. And so here on the left side in the purple bottle, we have natural weed preventer. This is 100% corn gluten meal, as opposed to preen weed preventer, which is 1.47 trifluralin. Oof, can't pronounce those very well. And so it's just the difference between a chemical control over on the right side versus a biorational control over on the left side. Another biorational control that people may be familiar with is neem oil. And neem oil works by controlling insect growth as well as smothering insects that might already be there or pests that might already be there. But the limitation is that it does require repeated applications, especially in instances of, heavy rains or any type of harsh weather. It's important to get out there and reapply that neem oil. But what is really cool about neem oil is that it has limited impact on things like pollinators. And then it's also, of course, really important not necessarily to be applying neem oil on the flowers during flowering season. And so it's best to apply neem oil to stems or branches. Neem oil is a pretty big go-to for some of the fruit trees, for example. So it's best to get neem oil out there before the blossoms open or after, like after they're gone. All right, so next one is sulfur and copper. And these can be used as fungicides, but it's important to use these sparingly, especially copper, because copper can actually build up in the soil, which in turn could damage the plant. Also, too high of a sulfur application could also damage the plant. And so these ones are more natural, however, need to be used with caution, as too much could damage the plant or the soil. All right, so the next step then is, let's say those biorational controls, the biological controls, and the cultural controls just didn't do the job. You need something more. Then we may have to turn to chemical controls. And it is important to note that many of these do carry some risk for use. And often that is in the form of human and pet health risks, so make sure that you're reading the warning label. And it's often that chemical controls are nonspecific, meaning that many of those pollinators can be impacted as well. And I spoke on this on the nicotinamide insecticides in the last talk on the 21st. And so just making sure that, you're not necessarily going for the most toxic control first to really kind of build up the way that you choose to treat those plants. So it starts with, knowing your plant and preparing your site, and then having beneficial insects, and then finally using some of those less toxic forms for pest and pathogen control before implementing chemical controls. All right, so that being said, let's go ahead and we're going to meet some of our troublemakers. So let's start by talking about the different types of pests and pathogens. So we'll start with microbes. This includes things like viruses, and so An example of this would be the mosaic viruses, which are transferred by aphids. And so what you can see right here is over on the left side, we have a leaf that has been infected and is showing signs of a mosaic virus. It has a mottled appearance, and that is on not only the leaves, but also on the fruit as well. So you can see that the little pumpkins here, they should have also a mottled form, and then this cucumber over here on the right side is also showing signs of a mottled appearance and deformed. It's kind of warty, but that is what you can expect with like a mosaic virus. It's something that impacts the leaves and the fruit. All right, next up is bacteria. And bacteria could be in the form of bacterial wilt. And this is often transmitted by spotted or striped cucumber beetles. All right, so what this looks like is over on the left side, you can see, I think we're looking at a squash patch of some sort. And this is a fully wilted plant. So this plant, it may be properly watered. You can see that the plants next to it are just fine. They look good and healthy, nice dark green leaves, but this plant in the middle here is super duper wilted. That's a sign that it is wilt. And now if you were to slice that stem open, stick those stems together and then pull it apart, what you'll find is in that middle picture there, you can see that there's some strings, and that is actually the bacteria. And so the bacterial wilt, the streaming is what it's called. It's apparent in a stem that's infected with bacterial wilt. And the bacteria live in the guts of striped and spotted cucumber beetles. And so you can see one of those striped cucumber beetles over on the right side. And it's important to say that the bacteria does not, in and of itself, overwinter in Minnesota, but it can within the guts of those insects. So just like I was talking about earlier with some of the different insects that can overwinter in the soil, this is also true for things like the striped and spotted cucumber beetle. All right, next up is fungi and water molds. And so this could be something like fusarium wilt, anthracnose, which infects our cucurbits, and so like our cucumbers and our melons, downy mildew, which also infects things like our cucurbits, cucumbers and melons, as well as early blight, which can impact a whole bunch of different things. And so here's a couple of pictures of that. Over on the left side, we have that fusarium wilt. And so this is a fungus that can overwinter for many years in the soil, and it is similar to bacterial wilt, in which the plant will wilt during the day and have some recovery at night, with the leaves eventually turning more and more yellow over time. And it may impact part of the plant or the whole plant. And now if we move on, the top, you'll see that this is the anthracnose. And so that's what a plant that's been infected with that might look like. And so you see that we've got these brown blotches. They're kind of papery. They kind of fall apart. That's also a fungal infection. Down in the lower corner on the right side, that's a sign of downy mildew. And so this is an angular discoloration within the confines of the vascular structure of the leaf. And so you can see that all of the discoloration, it kind of looks like a mosaic. That is a sign of downy mildew. And then in the middle picture, once again, we have that tomato plant that's dealing with early blight. And that's an infection that spreads from the bottom to the top. And it happens when leaves become infected by droplets. They first turn yellow and then they eventually brown. All right, so our next type of pest and pathogen would be our invertebrates. And those include things like beetles, aphids, and caterpillars. And I'm not going to show those because we've all got a pretty good idea of some of the beetles, aphids, and caterpillars that take residence within our gardens, as well as the munching mammals, including things like deer, rabbit, and our other rodents. So let's consider some quick solutions. Prevention is going to be one of the best things that you can do. And so considerations for your environment, making sure that the water is just enough. It's not too much and it's not too little. Likewise with the nutrients, the soil quality, the hardiness, and the light. Believe it or not all plants have the same requirements for having nutrient dense soil, right? And so some plants don't do well in those instances. Something that I left off here was actually pH. And so understanding the pH of your soil is also really important because some plants grow in a more alkaline soil. So pH is above 7 versus a more acidic soil or pH is below 7. Another thing to consider is something that we mentioned before, which would be companion plants. And so trap plants like nasturtium would be a great plant to have pests attracted to that nasturtium plant and away from other plants that would be otherwise susceptible, as well as deterrent plants. So things that have usually a strong aroma like marigolds, lavenders, and mints. And marigolds, lavenders, and mints play an especially awesome role at deterring things like rodents. And then prevention also includes things like pruning. And so that means removing the dead, damaged, or infected parts and also improving airflow. And so in the spring, this would be a good time to, prune back some of those trees that may have had some damage or infection. And then during the growing season with like our vegetable plants, it's important to do pruning on some of those more bushy plants like those tomatoes in order to improve airflow. And then also prevention includes considerations for resistant varieties. And that might be something like choosing plants that resist the things that your garden might have in the environment, including wilt, blight, powdery mildew, or whatever might be affecting your crops, and then making a plan for the following growing year. And then also, if you know that you have deer or rodents, including bunny rabbits, in your property, then making choices as to the best deer or rodent proof plants, and maybe even considering having a specific plot that would draw in the deer to a different location within your property, away from the space in which you are trying to grow the things that might be bringing them in otherwise. All right, so thank you for joining. Like I had mentioned, this is the last session of Science Saturdays for the winter season. I don't know when we'll be back. I hope to be doing more of the Science Saturdays from the comfort of my home as we go forward. But right now I'm actually planning some other stuff for the library. So with that, I thank you for joining, and make sure that you check out the University of Minnesota Extension for all of your gardening needs and questions, or alternatively, pop into your own state's specific extension. I think maybe even all 50 states have a Master Gardener program, which is part of the extension for the university. And it's just really a wealth of freely available information. And so one of my other favorites is Pennsylvania. They have some great resources there as well with a very similar growing climate. So with that, if you have any questions, drop them in the comments below and make sure that you check out the links. All right, thanks for tuning in. Bye.